The dress was the color of dust and sorrow, a light brown calico worn so thin you could see the summer light through the fabric at the shoulders and elbows. It was the only thing Leanne owned in the world, besides the memory of her father's hands and a name she no longer dared to speak. The mud of Jericho Springs Main Street was thick and greedy after a morning shower, sucking at her bare knees as she crawled. Each movement was a slow, deliberate agony. Hunger was a hollow ache below her ribs, a weakness that made the world swim at the edges. A boot appeared beside her head, the leather scuffed and splattered with the same dark mud she wore on her skin. "Get on out of it, you little beggar," a voice snarled. It was Gable, the man from the general store, his face a blotchy red mask of indignation. "You're scaring off my customers." Leanne flinched, curling inward, her forehead touching the wet, gritty earth. She said nothing. Words were a currency she could not afford, and in her halting English, they only ever seemed to buy more trouble. She had learned that lesson from her stepmother, whose final words had been a shove out the back door and a hissed command to never return. Gable kicked out, not hard enough to break bone, but with a contempt that struck deeper. The blow caught her on the hip, jarring a sob from her throat. She bit it back, tasting dirt. Humiliation was a hotter fire than hunger. "I said, get out!" Gable shouted, his voice drawing looks from the women clutching their shopping baskets and the men loitering near the assayer's office. They watched with a cold, flat curiosity, their faces impassive. She was not part of their town, not part of their world. She was a piece of refuse the railroad had left behind, and they were waiting for the wind to blow her away. Then, a different voice cut through the air, calm and low, yet carrying over the market chatter with the clarity of a bell. "That's enough." Leanne didn't look up. It was another man, another voice, another potential threat. She braced for another kick, another insult. The voice spoke again, closer this time. "Let her be." Silas Vance sat at a rough-hewn wooden table outside the Silver Spur Saloon, a half-eaten plate of beans and bacon before him. He hadn't moved from his chair. He had watched the girl crawl through the muck, his expression unreadable. He'd seen the way the townsfolk looked through her, the way Gable puffed himself up with petty cruelty. It was a familiar scene, one he'd witnessed in a dozen dusty towns from the Rockies to the Sierra Nevada. But something in the girl's stubborn silence, in the way her thin shoulders refused to slump completely, snagged on a part of him he thought had died long ago. Gable turned, squinting at the man in the shade of the saloon's overhang. He saw a drifter, lean and weathered, with a dusty hat pulled low. But then his eyes caught the gun belt, worn smooth with use, and the holstered Colt resting easy on a hard thigh. There was a stillness about the man that was more dangerous than any loud threat. "This ain't your concern, friend," Gable said, trying to sound bold. Silas picked up his fork and pushed a piece of bacon around his plate. He didn't raise his head. "You laid a foot on her." "That makes it my concern." His voice was still quiet, a murmur that promised nothing good. "Now, walk away." Gable hesitated. The men watching were no longer looking at the girl. They were all looking at Silas. In the silent, brutal arithmetic of the frontier, the equation had changed. A lone, starving Chinese girl was a zero. A man with a gun and a cold stare was a number you had to reckon with. Pride warred with a sudden, prickling sense of self-preservation in Gable's chest. Pride lost. He grunted, shot one last venomous look at Leanne, and stomped back toward his store, muttering about vagrants and the trouble they bring. The street held its breath for a moment longer, then the low hum of commerce resumed, though now it was threaded with whispers. Leanne remained frozen, a small, mud-caked heap in the center of the road. She heard footsteps approach, slow and steady. The scuffed boot stopped right in front of her. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Here," the quiet voice said. She felt a nudge against her shoulder. Not a kick. Something gentle. She risked a glance, peering through the curtain of her dark, matted hair. The man was holding out his plate. It was heaped with beans, salted bacon, and a thick slice of cornbread. The smell rose up, rich and overwhelming, and her stomach clenched with a painful, desperate cramp. She stared at the plate, then at his face. He was older than she'd thought, maybe 30, with lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and not enough sleep. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and they held no malice, only a kind of weary patience. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't frowning either. He was just waiting. Shaking, she reached out a grimy hand. Her fingers brushed against his as she took the plate. The metal was still warm. She expected him to say something, to demand payment or a promise, but he just straightened up. He looked over her head at the silent, watching town. Then his gaze dropped back to her. "Nobody touches her again," he said, and this time, it wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, laid down in the middle of Jericho Springs like a land claim. He turned without another word and walked back into the deep shadows of the saloon, leaving Leanne alone in the street with the first real meal she'd seen in a week and a silence that felt louder than any shout. The beans were gone in a frantic, desperate rush, scooped up with fingers that trembled so hard she could barely aim them at her mouth. She devoured the cornbread, the crumbs catching in her throat, and saved the bacon for last, chewing each salty strip slowly, letting the fat coat her tongue. When the plate was clean, she stayed where she was, huddled in the street, the warmth of the food spreading a fragile peace through her limbs. But the peace was edged with a new and unfamiliar terror. Before, she had been invisible. Now, a man had put his name on her. In a town like Jericho Springs, that could be a blessing, or it could be a death sentence. Silas returned as the sun began to dip behind the sawtooth peaks to the west, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and purple. He carried a bundle under his arm. He didn't speak, just stood before her until she slowly, painfully, got to her feet. Her knees were raw, her dress stiff with drying mud. "Come on," he said, his voice flat. He gestured with his head toward the edge of town. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the haze of her exhaustion. She clutched the empty plate to her chest like a shield. Her mind raced, filled with the warnings her father had given her long ago, stories of men who offered kindness with one hand while holding a cage in the other. Silas saw the panic in her wide, dark eyes. He let out a slow breath, a sound of profound weariness. "The doctor's wife runs a boarding house. You can get a room." A bath. He held out the bundle. "Clean clothes." She stared at the bundle, then back at his face, searching for the lie. She found none. There was no sly smile, no greedy light in his eyes. There was only that same unsettling stillness, a quiet that seemed to absorb all the noise and chaos around him. Hesitantly, she followed him. The boarding house was a plain, two-story clapboard building run by a woman named Martha, whose face was a roadmap of prairie hardships. She looked from Silas's impassive expression to Leanne's filthy state, and her lips tightened into a thin, disapproving line. "Silas, I can't," she said, her voice low. "You know how people are. Gable's already been over here, running his mouth." "I'll pay for a week in advance," Silas said, placing a few heavy silver coins on the counter. The sound was definitive. "She needs a bath and a bed. Nothing more." Martha looked at the coins, then at the girl who seemed ready to collapse. Leanne could feel the woman's judgment, a physical weight. She was dirt tracked into a clean house. She was trouble waiting to happen. But the silver gleamed on the polished wood of the counter, a powerful argument. With a sigh that surrendered to practicality, Martha took the money. "Upstairs. Last room on the left," she said, not to Leanne, but to Silas. "There's a pump out back for water. She'll have to haul her own." Silas nodded. He pushed the bundle of clothes across the counter toward Leanne. Their eyes met for a second. His were clear and direct. "You'll be safe here," he said. It wasn't a promise of comfort, just a promise of walls and a lock. For now, it was more than she had ever hoped for. The bath was a revelation. In a small, cold room behind the kitchen, she worked the pump handle until her arms ached, filling a tin tub with blessedly cool water. She scrubbed away the layers of mud and shame, watching the water turn dark. The clothes Silas had bought her were simple, a plain cotton shift and a dark blue work dress, sturdy and new. They felt impossibly fine against her clean skin. Looking at her faint reflection in the wavy glass of the small window, she saw a stranger. The grime was gone, but the fear remained, a permanent shadow in her eyes. The next day, Silas was gone. Leanne spent the day in her room, too afraid to venture out. She could hear the sounds of the town through her window, the rumble of wagons, the shouts of men, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Each sound was a potential threat. Late in the afternoon, she heard shouting from the street below. Peeking through the edge of the curtain, she saw Gable from the general store, flanked by two other burly men she didn't recognize. They were standing in front of the boarding house, and they were looking for Silas. "He ain't here, I told you." Martha's voice was sharp with agitation. "Then send out the girl," Gable yelled. "This is a decent town, Martha. We won't have armed vagrants and their foreign doxies causing trouble." Leanne shrank back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. The word doxier was a brand, burning her with a shame she didn't deserve. This was her fault. The kindness of a stranger had only painted a bigger target on her back. Just then, a lone rider came up the street, moving at a walking pace. It was Silas. His horse, a rangy buckskin, moved with the same unhurried confidence as its rider. He drew rein a few feet from the men, not dismounting. "You were looking for me, Gable?" Silas asked. His voice was conversational, but it silenced the other man's tirade instantly. "We want you and that girl out of Jericho Springs," Gable spat, emboldened by his companions. "We run a clean town here." Silas's gaze drifted from Gable to the two men beside him. He seemed to be measuring them, not as men, but as obstacles. "This town looks the same as any other I've seen. A few honest folk, and a few loud ones who think they own the dirt everyone walks on." He shifted slightly in the saddle. It was a small movement, but it made the leather creak, a sound that drew every eye to the gun on his hip. "I paid for the girl's room. She's bothering no one. This discussion is over. This is our town," one of Gable's men blustered, taking a half-step forward. Silas's hand didn't move. His eyes didn't blink. "Is it?" he asked softly. "Then you should know better than to block the street." The man froze. There was no overt threat, yet the air crackled with it. In the space of 3 quiet words, Silas had redrawn the lines of power in the dusty street. From her window, Leanne watched, mesmerized by his absolute stillness. He wasn't a fighter, she realized. He was a force of nature, like a rock in a river, and the angry water of Gable's fury was simply breaking against him. Defeated, the men shuffled their feet. They had come for a confrontation, but Silas refused to give them one. He simply existed, a quiet, immovable fact. With a final, impotent curse, Gable turned and led his men away. The street was quiet again. Silas looked up at the window of the last room on the left, his eyes meeting Leanne's for a brief, unreadable moment. Then he nudged his horse forward and continued down the street, disappearing around the corner. The immediate danger had passed. But Leanne understood with chilling certainty that Gable's humiliation would fester. And in the shadows, a man like Alastair Finch, who owned Gable's store and half the town besides, would not appreciate a drifter upsetting the delicate balance of his domain. Later that evening, a soft knock came at her door. It was Silas. He held a small, cloth-wrapped parcel. "Martha said you haven't eaten." She opened the door wider and he stepped inside the small, plain room. He placed the parcel on the single rickety table. It contained bread, cheese, and a piece of dried apple. Her stomach growled, betraying her. "Thank you," she whispered. It was the first time she had spoken to him. Her voice was rusty. He nodded, his gaze sweeping the sparse room. "This isn't safe anymore," he said. "Finch runs this town. Gable is his mouthpiece. They won't let this go." "Finch?" she asked, the name a foreign sound. "Alastair Finch. Owns the freight office, the land office, holds the paper on most of the businesses here, including this one." Silas's expression was grim. "He likes his town quiet and obedient. We're neither." Fear, a familiar companion, coiled in her gut. "I will go," she said, her voice barely audible. "I will not make trouble for you." Silas looked at her then, truly looked at her. He saw not a beggar or a burden, but a young woman trying to survive in a world that had declared her worthless. "It's too late for that," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "They're not just angry at you anymore. They're angry at me. We leave together. At first light." "Where?" The word was a breath of despair. There was nowhere for her. "I know a place. An old homestead claim, abandoned. It's a good day's ride from here. Water from a creek. We can lie low there until this blows over." It was a crazy plan, entrusting her life to a man she barely knew, a gunslinger with a past he never spoke of. But the alternative was to be cast back into the mud, at the mercy of men like Gable and Finch. She looked at his steady hands, at the weariness in his pale blue eyes, and made a choice. "I will be ready," she said. They rode out before dawn, two solitary figures slipping away from the sleeping town. The abandoned homestead was little more than a one-room dugout, built into the side of a low hill, but the roof was sound and a small, clear creek ran nearby. It was stark and empty, but it was safe. For days, they existed in a quiet, fragile truce. Silas hunted, bringing back rabbits for their stew. Leanne, remembering the skills her mother had taught her before she died, found wild onions and edible greens near the creek. They spoke little, but a language of shared tasks and mutual reliance began to form between them. She learned to read his moods by the set of his shoulders. He learned that her silence was not emptiness, but a deep well of observation. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he finally asked the question that had been hanging between them. "Why were you alone?" Leanne stared into the flames, the heat warming her face. She decided to trust him with the truth. "My father came from our home across the sea to work on the railroad," she began, her English slow and careful. "He saved his money. He bought a small house, a laundry business in a town east of here. He sent for me and my stepmother." She paused, the memory of physical pain. "He died a year ago. A sickness in his lungs from the blasting powder. My stepmother, she wanted the house, the money. A Chinese girl alone has no rights. She said I was a ghost at her table. She took everything. She put me out." As she spoke, she reached into the pocket of her new dress and pulled out a small object. It was a cricket, intricately carved from a piece of darkwood, its surface worn smooth. "This was my father's," she whispered, holding it out on her palm. "For luck. It is all I have of him." Silas looked at the small carving, then at her face, illuminated by the firelight. He saw the profound grief she carried. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the chirping of real crickets in the tall grass. "I had a sister," he said, his voice rough. The words sounded as if they were being pulled from a deep, painful place. "Younger than me. Her name was Clara. We were on a farm in Kansas. A land dispute, much like this one. A man with money and a forged deed wanted our land. I was young, hot-headed. I told him to go to hell. I thought being right was enough." His face was a mask of old pain. "He came back with friends. I was away, in town for supplies. When I got back, the house was burning. They were gone. My father, my mother, and Clara." He stopped, his throat working. "I found her in the field. I wasn't there to stop them. I tracked them for a month. All three of them. After that, I just kept moving." He looked at Leanne, and for the first time, she understood the source of his stillness, his quiet danger. It wasn't arrogance. It was grief, banked like coals, ready to flare at the slightest provocation. "When I saw Gable kick you," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I didn't see a stranger. I saw a ghost of my own." In that moment, everything shifted. He wasn't her savior, and she wasn't his burden. They were two survivors, each haunted by their own losses, finding a flicker of solace in the presence of the other. The chasm of race and culture that had separated them vanished, replaced by a bridge of shared sorrow. The quiet of their sanctuary was shattered 3 days later. For riders appeared on the horizon, moving fast. Silas recognized the lead rider instantly. Alistair Finch. "Get inside and bar the door," Silas ordered, his voice tight. He grabbed his rifle from beside the doorway. "Stay away from the window." Leanne scrambled inside, her heart pounding. She slid the heavy wooden bar across the door and pressed herself into the darkest corner of the dugout. Finch and his men reined in their horses 20 yards from the cabin. Finch, a man with a soft body and hard eyes, smiled. It was not a pleasant sight. "Vance," he called out. "You're on my property. I have the deed right here." He patted his coat pocket. "You and the girl have 1 hour to clear out, or we'll clear you out." "This is homestead land, Finch," Silas shouted back from behind the cover of the door frame. "It's not yours to claim." "Everything in this valley is mine to claim if I say it is," Finch replied, his voice oozing confidence. "I'm a patient man. But my patience is wearing thin. The girl is an incitement. A disruption to the natural order. Give her to us, and you can ride away clean." "That's not going to happen," Silas said, his voice flat and final. Finch's smile vanished. "So be it." He gave a sharp nod to his men. A gunshot cracked the afternoon air. A splinter of wood flew from the doorframe near Silas's head. He ducked back, bringing his rifle up. He didn't want this fight. He was a gunslinger, but he was not a killer by trade. He was a man who had only ever used his gun to answer a debt of violence. But Finch had just called the debt due. He fired back, aiming for the ground near the horses. The animals shied and reared, throwing Finch's men into confusion. It was the opening he needed. He fired again, this time catching one of the men in the shoulder. The man cried out and tumbled from his saddle. The world erupted into a chaos of shouting and gunfire. Inside, Leanne was pressed against the dirt wall, her father's wooden cricket clutched in her hand so tightly its sharp edges dug into her palm. She prayed to a god she wasn't sure was listening anymore. A bullet tore through the wooden door, whining past her head. Another slammed into the dirt wall beside her. Silas was shouting something she couldn't understand. She could hear the desperate exchange of fire, the grunts of men, the terrified whinnying of a horse. Then, there was a sharp cry of pain that was not from one of Finch's men. It was Silas. A terrible silence fell. Leanne held her breath. Had they killed him? Was she next? "Come on out, girl." It was Finch's voice, triumphant. "Your protector is down. Don't make this harder on yourself." Her blood ran cold. But then, through the silence, she heard a low groan from just outside the door. Silas was alive. Wounded, but alive. A fierce, desperate courage ignited within her. She would not let them take him. She would not be a victim again. Her eyes darted around the dim dugout. Silas's pistol, his Colt, was on the small table where he'd left it. She had seen him clean it, load it. She knew, in theory, how it worked. Her hands shaking, she picked it up. It was impossibly heavy. Taking a deep breath, she crept to the door, listening. "He's finished," one of the men said. "Let's just rush the door." "Patience," Finch snapped. "Let the girl come out. It's cleaner that way." Leanne knew they would not be patient for long. She lifted the heavy bar, the wood scraping loudly. The sudden noise made the men outside fall silent. She took another shuddering breath, pulled the door open a few inches, and fired the gun into the open. The recoil slammed her back against the wall, the sound deafening in the small space. She hadn't aimed at anything, but the unexpected shot from inside the cabin had its intended effect. The men, thinking Silas was still fighting, scrambled for cover. In that moment of confusion, Silas, clutching a bloody wound on his side, dragged himself to his feet. He used the last of his strength to raise his rifle and fire one more, carefully aimed shot. The man who had been creeping toward the door cried out and fell, his leg buckling beneath him. That was enough for Finch. He was a businessman, not a warlord. He calculated his losses, 2 men wounded, his element of surprise gone. He spat on the ground, his face a mask of fury. "This isn't over, Vance," he screamed. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his one remaining man close behind. Leanne rushed out. Silas was slumped against the wall, his face pale, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. "Silas," she cried, dropping the heavy pistol and rushing to his side. He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his pain-filled eyes. You fired," he rasped. "I had to," she said, tears streaming down her face as she tore a strip from her dress to press against the wound. He managed a weak, grim smile. As his head lolled to the side, his gaze caught something on the ground where Finch had been. A piece of paper dropped in the hasty retreat. "Get that," he grunted, before his eyes closed. Leanne retrieved the paper. It was a flimsy telegraph slip, smudged with dirt. The message was short, but its meaning was a bolt of lightning. It was addressed to Alistair Finch. It read, "Is it done? The girl must not return." Payment upon confirmation. It was signed with a name that made the world stop turning, her stepmother's. 3 months passed. The high summer sun gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The dugout on the hill was now a home. A sturdy corral held 2 horses. A small, flourishing garden, protected from deer by a wattle fence, was heavy with late-season squash and beans. Silas's wound had healed slowly, leaving a puckered scar on his side that ached when the weather turned cold. Leanne had nursed him with a fierce determination, using knowledge of herbs her mother had taught her to keep the wound clean and the fever down. In the long, quiet days of his recovery, they had talked. He taught her more English, and she taught him the names of the stars in her own language. The telegraph message had changed everything. Armed with proof of the conspiracy, Silas had done something he hadn't done in 10 years. He sent a telegraph of his own to a U.S. Marshal in Carson City, a man who owed him a favor from a lifetime ago. The law, when it finally arrived in Jericho Springs, was swift and unsparing. The Marshal's investigation unraveled Finch's web of fraudulent deeds and intimidation. Finch was arrested, his empire crumbling overnight. Leanne's stepmother, when confronted with the evidence, vanished, fleeing the territory with what little she could carry. The news came to the homestead via a letter, delivered by a rider from the Marshal's office. One afternoon, Leanne stood on the small porch they had built, looking out over the valley. She wore a dress of sturdy blue calico she had sewn herself from fabric Silas had bought on a supply run to a different town, a town where no one knew their names. She was no longer the girl in the dusty brown dress, crawling in the mud. She was a homesteader. Under the Homestead Act of 1862, as a single woman, she had filed a claim on their 160 acres. The land was legally hers. Silas came to stand beside her, leaning against a porch post. He followed her gaze across the land, their land. The silence between them was no longer fragile, it was comfortable, deep, and unbreakable. On the rough-hewn mantel inside the cabin, next to a jar of dried wildflowers, sat a small, intricately carved wooden cricket. It was no longer a symbol of what was lost. It was a foundation stone for what was being built. The Marshal's letter said Gable is running the general store now, Silas said quietly. Telling everyone who'll listen how he always knew Finch was a crook. Leanne allowed herself a small, rare smile. People change their minds. Some do, he agreed. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, the resilience that had been there all along, hidden beneath the grime and fear. He had set out to save her, but somewhere along the way, they had ended up saving each other. They had both been ghosts, haunted by the past. But here, on this small patch of unforgiving land, they had found that the only way to lay a ghost to rest was to give it a home. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her hand. She did not pull away. Her hand turned, her fingers lacing with his. Together, they watched the sun set on their valley. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.